Thanks, Scott. Um, I'm excited to be here again. And today's topic, I want to talk about where the line is. I was thinking this morning, this is another one of those really interesting recovery correlations that I think could have some really huge impact when we take it to relationships. So I'm going to start with a question that I want you each to think about. And if you want to share your answer to this, you can put it in the Q&A and we'll discuss. But um, the question is, where is your line, or what needs to happen in order for you to be willing to have one of those serious, difficult conversations in your relationship, whether that's with your significant other, with a child, with a coworker, a boss. Where's the line for you? What has to happen before you are willing to have a serious, difficult conversation? So think about that a little bit. If you want to put it in the chat, we can discuss that a little bit later. But where I feel like this really gets its roots in recovery is those of you who are in active addiction recovery or have a loved one who is. A lot of recovery, I think, is about moving our line up. Moving from kind of chaotic moment by moment living, which is really survival focused, which is kind of the hard addiction, into moving into life that's a little more deliberate, a little more thoughtful, a little more planned out. And I think for a lot of the addicts that I work with, they want to see themselves move from this, in the moment I was confronted with this opportunity to relapse and I decided not to, into I saw it coming from a mile off and I made decisions that made my life a lot easier. So I didn't get to that critical decision point. I put the fire out when it was a spark, whether that's, I know that resentment feeds it, whether it's kind of feeling lovesick and lost for relationships. We kind of move the line forward. And for a lot of loved ones, I would say almost all of the loved ones that I work with, they want to see their partner, their loved one get to that point too, where it's not waiting until we have a raging inferno to bring in the fire department, but I catch that little spark. I attend to the little things ahead of time. So in our relationships, I think we tend to keep our lines at where the crisis is. For a lot of reasons. Even when we get healthier in our own recovery, it can be really difficult to think about going back to our partner and saying, hey, something's just slightly off today between you and I. Can we have a conversation about it? Usually we wait until it's already erupted into a fight, or we wait until, our boundary's been violated for the 13th time and now we can't take it anymore. Or we wait until there's already an argument coming and, it's clear that the love is already lost between the two of us, so we might as well bring all the issues on the table. So something that I would encourage you attendees to think about is where you can move that relationship line up. So it's not just focused on the crisis. When I'm angry at you, this is when I'm ready to talk to you, or when you violated my boundary for the 13th time, or when I can feel you, winding up, but I'm going to let it go until you really get all the way wound up. But moving that up to, at the first sign of trouble, can I check it out with you and say, hey, what's going on? Can I check it out with you and say, how are you feeling? What are you thinking about? Or even get more specific. Hey, I know XYZ happened, or I know XYZ is going on, and I know generally you feel this way about it. Do you want to talk about it before this gets to, blow up proportions? So I'm curious, maybe to hear from some of our attendees, or maybe even some of your thoughts, Scott, on where that relationship line is usually at for you, and where you might want to move it.
Yeah, we've got just had a couple people join. The topic today is where do you draw the line between what you're willing to, how much you're willing to put up with before you have the difficult conversation, which Jon just talked a little bit about. And he was wondering, he'd like everyone to put in the Q&A maybe where that is in your own relationship. And I have kind of a related question that is going to push briefly off topic. But what do you do when initiating that conversation, when you recognize that somebody's or something is going wrong and you initiate that conversation and that this facilitates the explosion?
Oh, such a good question. I would guess that's why most of us leave the conversation until it's gotten so big, because how do you bring up with somebody when 95% of the relationship or the interaction actually feels pretty good? How do you bring up with them that little pebble in your shoe and not feel like you're totally derailing things? So, a couple pieces of advice that I would give there is, first of all, make sure that you're in a place where you can take several deep breaths, both as you're discussing and leading up to it. If you're in that place where there's no room for deep breaths, there's no room for slowing down, you've probably already gone over the edge. And I'm a big fan in relationships of looking at approaching each other in a way that guarantees that our partner will have an opportunity to hear us. A lot of times, a while ago, I did a series on the four horsemen: defensiveness, criticism, stonewalling, and I always forget one of the four, and it's always a different one. But when we wait until when our nervous system is in that place where we can't slow it down, we're going to speak to our partner, or the person we're in a relationship with. We're going to speak to them in a way that guarantees they won't be able to hear us. So first, make sure that you can take a few deep breaths. I think the second thing that I would say is make sure that you can utilize what we call a soft startup, where you might actually be really upset, you might be really triggered, but can you start that conversation in a way that shows your partner that you want this to be a connected conversation? So being able to say something like, I really appreciate the effort that I see from you right now, and I can feel that on a daily basis. Would you be open to helping me clear one of my building resentments right now? Because I'm noticing that I have a pebble in my shoe, and I don't want that to turn into something that completely derails our relationship for days. I'd rather take care of that now than have it build up to a point where I'm so angry and I'm so over the top, and you're going to feel blindsided by it. So are you open to that right now? And that would be the third piece. I would ask for the buy-in of the person that you're in relationship with, because it might take them some time. They may be humming along feeling like 100% of things are fine, and when you say 5% of things are off, they may have a little bit of a whiplash reaction, and that could be understandable because they're not in your thoughts, and they're not in your heart and don't know what's happening. So just saying, hey, heads up, I need to clear the hopper with you a little bit. I need you to help me reorient on some things. Are you open to that? And they may need some time to get into that place. They may need to take some deep breaths. They may need to remind themselves, I don't want to take this defensively, or I don't want this to turn into a fight. And so give them some time to, set their own agenda there. Give them some time to get ready to be a good listener. What you have to say. A good question, Scott.
So how much time is reasonable for them? Does it depend on the person? Does it depend on how much internal, shame or damage or whatever that's going to cause them to,
Yeah. I think there's context there. I think you have to look at the relationship history. I have couples that I work with that to lead up to a difficult conversation, they need like 3 marital sessions and just as many individual sessions and lots of contact with their sponsor to get ready. And it's a matter of like, hey, I don't feel like we have a good rhythm around the dishes getting done. But that's where the relationship is at. I think at a minimum, and I've talked about this before, 20 minutes is the minimum amount of time we need for our nervous system to settle after it's been surprised, shocked, sent over the edge. So, at a minimum, I think that's a good range. I'd like to talk to you about this. Could you be ready in 20 minutes? Or let me give you some time to think about where you've got to orient on this. Can we check back in 20 minutes? And if you're not feeling calm and open at that time, you can let me know if you need some more time. I think it's far less about the let's set the appointment and have the conversation here, and more about the commitment to do it together. So if we're coming back together and your partner says, I'm still upset and I need some more time, great. Give them time to get in a place where they can show up and be a good partner for you. Or if you're saying, I brought this up with you and you asked for that time out, that period to get ready, and I spun in my head that whole time, and now I'm so anxious and I'm so over the top here. I'm going to need some time now to get ready to talk about this. I think the key there is that you're continuing to check in with each other and check in on that commitment to be in space where you can hear each other out. I think when you get to something in the order of like days have gone by or even hours have gone by and we haven't gone back and said, how are you doing? That's where that starts to feel a lot like avoidance and kicking the can down the road.
So there's
And
a
that,
need to continually check in to make sure it does actually happen.
yeah. And I think that's where we can get really anxious when when we or our partner says, I'm not ready right now. And then there's no returning and revisiting, okay, what do you need to get ready? Or are you on the road to getting ready? If there's no turning back and checking in on that, we just heighten the anxiety and we heighten the tension.
I think one of the things that's important, particularly for couples to remember, is a fight is you're on the same team, so instead of fighting each other, you can fight the problem.
Mm-hmm.
This is the problem. Let's find a way to attack the problem instead of attacking each other.
That's a really important, I think, orientation for couples to be able to have. Some couples, there's so much water under the bridge, or there's a fundamental difference in how they see life that they're not able to do that, and that's a sad reality for some couples. But I think that's another reason to look at where's the line, because I can guarantee with any issue that might exist between me and my spouse, if I leave it long enough, it will become a resentment I have against her instead of an issue that we could face together. And that's where I feel like the timing on this is really important, and not letting that lie for too long, because you may turn an issue that's a we shoulder to shoulder, or me and I could use your help issue, into an issue between me and you. And it happens with kids too. Just this weekend, my family was vacationing at big extended family at the lake kind of weekend, and my kids are going to bed like 2 hours later than they normally do, so they're low on sleep and super cranky. And any little change in plan or adjustment to their expectations, it sends them over the top. So my 9-year-old was in one of those, and he was really angry. He was making all sorts of threats, like calling all sorts of names. And I was able, in that moment, I was able to hold some calm space. And it was probably within 20 minutes he signaled me to come close, and he said, I'm really tired, I'm really upset now, I'm sorry that I've been saying that. And we were able to hug and make up and help each other out there. But if that was something that would continue all day, I guarantee by the end of the day I've been like, I'm not talking to that little turd, and like his window has passed, and like I would not have been in a good space. I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that we do best when we see it as an issue that we can face shoulder to shoulder versus it gets in between us. And that's why we would look at putting our line in a place that reserves our margins and kind of that emotional spillover space we have in our relationships, rather than only going into that difficult relationship space whenever there's a crisis. That's a very tiring way to do a relationship.
So for people, we've got people still filtering in here. We're talking about where the line is for you in your relationships, romantic, family, work, whatever, where you have the difficult conversation, and most of us wait too long and things get out of hand. So instead of fighting the problem, we fight each other.
Mm-hmm.
So when that is, so by the way, if you have questions or comments, send them to us in the Q&A, everybody. So, usual deal here. Jon, when the relationship dance for so long has been waiting too long to have the conversation, what kind of coaching do you do? What are the tricks that people can do to recognize it sooner and address it sooner?
I think the first thing is we have to talk about it. We have to acknowledge that the dance is going on, and that it's a dance that we end up really stepping on each other's toes. So saying, I think we avoid conflict. I have a couple that I worked with in the recent past where on the phone to schedule the appointment, they said, our big issue is that we are so avoidant of conflict, and they were right. And so that was every issue, just about every issue. In the beginning, I would say, is this one of those conflict avoidant things? And I would have to bring that up. And eventually each individual was able to say, I'm avoiding this part of the conflict, or I'm avoiding this part of the reality. And they could really start dancing differently. And it was interesting to see where in the past, when they would do that dance, the partner who was less committed to doing the avoidance dance would get really angry and critical. But when their partner started saying, hey, this is one of those times I can feel myself avoiding, their partner got really compassionate and got really soft. And so it changed the whole dynamic just by being able to say, this is what we do. I think that's the way we start solving any kind of problem. I think a next step might be to start outlining, well, how do we want to do this, or how do we want to try this? I've worked with couples before who have said, starting this conversation face to face is really scary for us. So like maybe if you could send it to me in a text or an email or write me a note so I kind of have a heads up, and then when we get face to face, I might feel a little more prepared. So we experiment with a lot of different ways of doing it rather than just going down the same road again and again. To say I don't want to go down that road and then not have an alternative, usually we just end up going down that road again. So we have to be willing to brainstorm and get creative in doing something a little different.
Yeah, I love the bit about, people saying, I'm avoiding this because this is how I'm feeling. This is what I'm afraid of. This is, that's kind of the basis of emotional intimacy is, telling people what we're afraid of and what we want, what we need, and what we don't, So I love that. I mean, of course they're going to get compassionate because they're going to feel more connected.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question here. What do you do within yourself that allows you to give people space like you just did for your son? In other words, what prep work do you do so you can actually do that when what you really want to do is react in a less than healthy way?
I think one of the biggest things for me, and particularly with him, it's recognizing that this relationship is a long-term thing. Like, it's not just about what's happening in the next 20 minutes, or it's not just about what's happening in the next day. In fact, when he was having a really hard time, we had changed some plans around lunch on him, and he was outside, and I was in the kitchen of the place we were staying with my wife, and one of the first things I said to her is I said, I'm really worried about when he's a teenager, because this dynamic here is going to get more and more difficult, and I think his feelings are going to get stronger, and his ability to express those feelings, he's going to get better at it as time goes on, and I think that's going to open the door for him to be able to experience anger with me on a deeper level. And I said to her, I really just want to be able to stay connected with him when that day comes. And so for me, I think a lot about the future, and I think a lot about what I want to be able to give my relationships down the road. So that reoriented me to the moment. And I was like, oh, this isn't about getting him to back off today or getting him to calm down today. This is about the next time this comes up, is he going to be open to like staying connected to me when he's angry? And so that reorientation, I said, I was thinking like, there's not much I need to say to him right now. I've let him know that I'm available. I've even let him know what I could do for him. I said, I can't take you out for lunch today, but I would be happy to make you something that you would want to eat. And so I put some invitations out there, and then I waited for him to give me a signal as to where he wanted to go next. And honestly, when he called me into the room to talk, I was like, oh, he's just going to be yelling more, because it was this very like from behind the door, like this, come here. And, I even came in with a bit of humor, and I was like, I feel like I've been summoned to a spy meeting. I said, let's sit on this bench and we can't look at each other. And, I kind of got a little playful to begin with, to kind of test, like, is he ready for a repair? And it was really that, I would say the biggest thing there was recognizing that this is a long-term relationship, not a short-term problem. And I'd say that's probably the biggest piece of the prep work, is I remember that I want positive interactions with everyone that I have relationships with in the future. So, usually in the back of my mind in an individual reaction or an individual interaction is, how does this set me up for the next interaction I'm going to have with this person? And that reminds me to be calm and patient and soft and curious instead of defensive.
Yeah, and it's a sign of love to give somebody that space, which you know, most of us, if we're on this webinar, we probably didn't learn this when we were young. We probably didn't have John as a parent.
And this is also the product of 10 years of therapy focusing on this short fuse I have. And I'm just starting to feel like, oh, wow, I can respond differently. And wow, I don't have to take this personally. So, to say that it's just this little switch in my mind, that's the product of a decade of therapy that's focused on this intensively. So
we've got a question here in the chat feature that we'll go to. Do you have any tips or techniques on how to listen to your partner with empathy and not resentment, to try and keep an open mind and actually hear what they say about the future processes with no anger involved? So, how do you listen to your partner and actually hear them when you're angry?
This right here, I think, has been one of the most effective tools that I've used with couples. I'll actually have, when it's one of those, we have a very different opinion here and we have very different outcomes we want and we're not hearing each other. I'll actually assign, okay, you're the speaker, you're the listener, and I'll hand the listener a pad and paper and I said, I want you to write down just about verbatim what your partner's saying. And there's a couple of things that does. So it takes you off the hook for immediately responding, which is usually where listening gets derailed, is your partner will say something and it's like, wait a minute, I have to correct you there, or I have to ask, what do you mean by that? Or do you recognize, it's this whole role of dominoes. So if your job is just to listen really well and to capture the words your partner's saying, it takes a lot of pressure off of you. And then when your partner pauses, or when you feel like, okay, I've got a lot of information here, you'll read back, I heard you say, and you'll read back, and then you'll ask, do you feel like I'm hearing you? Do you feel understood? And usually just that act of reading back, your partner will have more to say and they'll get clearer and clearer. And when the goal is understanding instead of resolution, I think it's a lot easier to be a good listener. Again, a lot of issues that we need to resolve in relationships, they may be of a critical nature, meaning if this continues unchecked much longer, we won't make it. But the process of repairing is a long one. The process of resolution is a long one. So really seeking for understanding first, I think, can be very, very helpful. And it doesn't hurt a lot to listen, even if you fundamentally disagree with your partner. Being able to state back to them in terms that they could accept and say, yes, you heard me, that goes a long way in lowering some defenses. So I would say, to start with, it might be off-putting or might feel weird, but to start with, have a pen and paper ready and say, what you're saying, I can tell that this is really important to you, so I'm going to take notes so that I can understand, so that I can make sure that you feel understood by me. And that may even be a ritual that you want to introduce and go back and forth. And so, after 20 minutes of speaking, you may say, now it's my turn to listen to you. Why don't you unfold this? And again, at the end of the interaction, we go for the goal. Do I feel more understood? Do I feel more heard? Versus, do we have a solution?
Yeah, I want to reiterate something John said in that when the goal is to understand rather than resolve, we're going to make a lot more progress. Again, what I talked about earlier, this is a sign that you love somebody. I want to understand what you're saying. I don't have to agree with you, but I want to understand where you're coming from.
Yep.
That is, to me, somebody saying, I love you enough that I want to understand what's going on in your head and why you're so mad or whatever. I mean, taking time with your child to say, I'm sorry, tell me what you're mad about. Okay, here are the possible, understand it, and then offer some resolution or some possibilities. It's such a beautiful approach.
Well, I like what you're saying, Scott, about it. That's a sign of love. I think that's a real sign of mature love, is recognizing I don't have to agree with you to hear you. And I think that's a wonderful gift when we receive it. I think some of the times where I have felt most listened to is where I know someone fundamentally disagrees with me, yet they took the time to understand my position.
Yeah. And I do that a lot in my work life. If I disagree, if I think we should do something differently or whatever, I say, okay, and I'll repeat back, what I hear you saying is this, and the reason you want to do it this way is this. Do I have that right? And sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't, and I get a further explanation, and through that, we're always able to reach some kind of a resolution.
Mhm.
Maybe we're both happy, maybe neither of us is happy, maybe one of us is, but we get somewhere and we at least understand where we're coming from. It
Yeah.
keeps us from fighting
Yeah.
because we have a lot of strong personalities, at our company. Uh,
Mhm.
so we got another question here for you, John. Is there a good way to talk about conflict with an avoidant person? There's more to that, but I'm just going to leave it right there because that's a huge question.
Yeah. So the important thing to recognize, there's four ways that we measure attachment or a person's willingness to be in relationship with each other. And I've tried to use the whiteboard feature on this before, and it just doesn't work very well. So I'll hold this up here. So this quadrant up here, this would be the secure attachment, where our approach is high, so our willingness to go into the relationship is high and our anxiety is low. And then we have preoccupied, and this is someone whose anxiety is high, but their approach is also high. So they feel a lot of anxiety, but they don't mind getting close. And then we have the avoidant person here, where their approach is really low and their anxiety is really high. So this is the person that this question is talking about. And then we have the dismissive person here, where the anxiety is low and the approach is low. The thing that all four of these have in common is they want connection. And I would say that's one of them. I would say that's probably a fundamental thread for all 7 billion plus people on this earth, is they want connection. The way they go about getting it is different. So if your partner is avoidant, and you're not, that's going to make for a very tense relationship, but it can be done. Um, two avoidant people could be really happy together. Everyone who lives with them would be driven crazy. But so keep in mind that this avoidant person wants connection. They want attachment. They're just going to go about it in a very non-direct way, very non-confrontational way. So one of the ways that you might start, or that you might conceptualize of this kind of long term, is, I know this isn't your preferred way of connecting, but it's really important for me that we can talk about problems in a real way. Um, I know that would be a gift for you to give that to me, because I know, maybe I know fundamentally that you don't work that way. But could you go there for me for now? Could you go there for me for the next 20 minutes? One of the things that I think drives the avoidant person to be avoidant is when conflict arises, depending on their past or whatever, they may feel like this is not going to end. So giving them a time limit, giving them parameters. It may even be, this is a very protracted conversation. So again, this is where, letter writing might have an advantage. And maybe in the conversation, you may say, I just want to put this out there and I would like you to think about it. And maybe we could circle back tomorrow, or maybe we could circle back in a couple of days. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So slowing down the pace of the conversation enough where this person can keep up. Because keep in mind, for the avoidant person, they have a lot of anxiety going around real-time connection. So if you can mitigate some of your anxiety by not being able to talk right now, you may be able to help them to mitigate some of their anxiety by saying, I can take this at a pace that might be more, I can take this at a pace that might make more sense for you now, even though it's not what I need. So I think the big thing about dealing with a person who's avoidant is getting into their space and on their pace for the relationship, while still holding ground for what you need. It might be a very protracted conversation and it might drive you crazy, but do you want to arrive at the conclusion of the solution all by yourself, or do you want to arrive there with your partner? And that's part of that orienting question is, how do we want to arrive at connection? Do I want to drive my partner there, or drag my partner there kicking and screaming, or do I want them to follow me? Do I want them to accept my invitation?
Yeah, can you hold that back up, John?
Yeah.
The attachment styles, sometimes people bounce between a couple of them. I bounce between dismissive and avoidant.
Mm-hmm.
So you can catch someone there not entirely avoidant or whatever. And the other thing is, about attachment styles, research shows that our attachment styles develop very early in life, often pre-verbal, and they don't really change that much. So if you've got an avoidant, you've got an avoidant.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm never going to be a securely attached person. I mean, you can develop, earn security through healthy relationships with other people over time, and I've done that to a certain extent. But my hardwiring is still, teetering on dismissive, avoidant. So okay, that's
Yeah. Well, and that may be recognizing too. I really like that point, Scott. I also believe that we can earn secure attachment, but I do tend to believe, and the research tends to show, our default setting doesn't change. So I'm a lot more preoccupied, and I have to remind myself that I'm going to feel a lot of anxiety, and I'm going to watch people closely. And so when I can remind myself and take that breath or two, I can approach someone more securely, or I can receive someone more securely. But my default setting is to be preoccupied. So again, if you have an avoidant, know that this might be their starting point every time. And if you come at them in a really direct way, assuming that they're secure, you're going to miss them every time. But if you give them a little more of a soft invitation, you give them a little more of a, I'd like you to be prepared to talk about this. Can you get there? Because that person wants connection, I think more often than not, they'd say, yes, if I don't have to do it right now, or yes, if I don't feel like I'm in the spotlight. I have friends who, she's really preoccupied and he's really avoidant, and they drive each other crazy on that. But I've watched over the last 10 years in their marriage, I've watched them really navigate how to do that. And they give each other a lot more gifts as far as this is concerned. There's times where he'll come out of his shell enough and he'll say, I can see this is really bugging you. I feel like I have a window right now where we could talk about it. And she appreciates that. And a lot of times, she'll have to say, I know this gives you anxiety to think about, but I want to put this on your plate so you can know this is an important place to meet me. And sometimes she's like, and I know we'll come back to this in 2 weeks, but she's gotten to know his timeline, and her connection to her spouse is more important to her than her having the issue resolved right now. She's gotten to that point. So she approaches him and he approaches her in a way that fosters the connection rather than the resolution.
Yeah, that empathy and understanding and willingness is, yet again, it's another way to say, I love you. I care enough about you to operate on your timeline a little bit. So I want to get to the rest of this question. So the initial question was, is there a good way to talk about conflict with an avoidant person, especially with topics that have been brought up numerous times over the years, only to get shut down, or when it becomes glaringly obvious that the addict avoidant, just doesn't care about my needs. And I'm hoping you'll address the last part of that.
Yeah. So, with the true avoidant, I don't think you're going to get shut down, and I don't think you're going to get you may interpret that they don't care, but they're not going to give you those clear signals. With someone who's dismissive, you will get shut down, and you will get the explicit feeling that they don't care. So there might be some reorientation in there, as you may not be dealing with an avoidant person, you may be dealing with a dismissive person, and that can change the game. That can change the approach. This is one of those things that I see with someone who's earnest in recovery and who is recognizing their need to be in recovery, that dismissiveness or that shutting down, that eventually changes over time, that cracks over time. But that's really contingent on them working on themselves and their emotions. A lot of addicts that I work with, they're so consumed with their own emotions that they can't even name or talk about, and their own needs that they don't even recognize are there, that they have no bandwidth for anybody else. And as they start kind of getting to know themselves and taking care of themselves better, they do have room for other people. So I think this is a very difficult dynamic, especially if that person is not getting into themselves and what's going on with them. There may be only so far you can go with that. I always look at situations like this where this may not lead to a mutual outcome, or it may not lead to something that brings us together. I always look at, am I proud of how I'm approaching this? There's going to be some days where I'm not going to be proud of not saying anything because I'll feel like I'm betraying myself. And there's other days where I'm not going to be proud if I say too much because I realize that I just gave my heart to a brick wall again. So you really got to gauge, like, based on how I'm doing today, how am I going to be proud of how I handled this in the future? Did I give my partner what they needed? Did I give myself what I needed in this? Sometimes to be a good partner, you have to give clear information, even if nothing is done with that. And, sometimes to be good to ourselves, we have to pick our battles. And this is a difficult situation for sure.
Yeah, this is, I know this questioner, and it's a situation where the addict is not overly interested in recovery, which I think makes that whole process much, much harder.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think I've mentioned this resource before. Of course, there's Dr. Rob's book, Prodependence, which I think addresses some of this. I also really like the resources in Getting Your Loved One Sober, and the subtitle is Without Nagging, Threatening, and two other things that we tend to do when we're anxious about our relationship. There's a lot we can do on our side of the street to bring some relief to those kind of dynamics, even if somebody doesn't engage in change. And sometimes that's the best we can do. It may not be about talking to that person in terms that they're going to engage, but talking to that person in terms where we don't overextend or put ourselves in a position to be abused or hurt again. But that we're still proud of how we're interacting with that relationship.
I know some therapists, Jon, have like conflict resolution contracts that when couples are really struggling, like, this is how we will go about discussing, complicated issues. It won't happen before 9 a.m. It won't happen after 9 p.m. It won't happen in the bedroom. It won't happen in front of the kids. If one of us needs a timeout, we can separate for 15 minutes and then come back, and the conversation won't last more than a half an hour. And if we're really stuck, we'll call our therapist or whatever. Is that something that you do, or you recommend, or do you think that hampers the process?
No, I think that can be helpful, especially when there's a lot of fear going into emotionally packed conversations. Recognize that your first draft of that contract is going to be purely aspirational, because when the feelings actually come up and the conversation starts, even if you have it written down, you're probably not going to slow down and say, oh, wait a minute, we agreed to this, so here's what we're going to do. If you do that, you're really lucky. I think it's more aspirational. It's something to go back after the fact and say, how did we do? What could we do in the future? Like, this is how the brain works. Is the reason why we keep memory is not to have a photo album of our lives. It's to predict the future. So we have to go back to, okay, how did that one go? And as we say, like, I came in too hot. I wish I would have taken a timeout, or I wish this is something that we would have been able to call a timeout and talk to our therapist about. That's what really starts changing the brain. So I love the idea of discussing this together, and even writing it down as a way to keep yourself accountable. But just keep in mind that accountability is probably going to come a lot after the fact, because you're going to learn through trial and error too. I remember the first time I tried to enact a timeout strategy with my spouse, I made the mistake of not talking to her about it ahead of time. I just said, I'm going to go for a walk. And I came home and she was convinced that I was ready to divorce her. And I was in a calm place. But because I didn't negotiate that with her ahead of time, it felt like abandonment to her. And she had no idea what I was trying to accomplish on that walk. And that's something that I learned, is that I can't take a time out without letting her know why I'm taking that time out and what I'm going to be doing in that time. And so, yeah, I think a lot of those contracts, the ones that work, will come out of trial and error and being willing to say, we said that we weren't going to stay up past 9 o'clock, but when I get home from work at 8:30 and we eat dinner, that leaves us 2 minutes to resolve things. Like, we need to find some more time. And I think most things in a relationship are, when we find things that work, it's because we've made a mess and we evaluated that mess, and we made little adjustments as we went along based on our experience.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the trial and error, because that is how we learn as people. I have a good friend who's a therapist. We go to lunch once in a while, and how you doing? You just check in, kind of stuff. And once in a while, he'll say, "I'm in tremendous emotional pain. I'm so excited about that." And the first time he did that, I was like, bleep is wrong with you? It means I'm about to learn something. You know, I'm in pain. I'm going to learn from this. I'm going to be a better person because something is wrong. And I thought, wow, what an interesting way to reframe current misery is, oh, I can learn and grow from this. You know, and any relationship conflict in particular is a chance for the couple or the parent and the child to learn and grow.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's, you know, all of this stuff that we've talked about in these webinars around relationships. I really hope that's the spirit that, you know, the participants and those of you who are listening start to take this in is there's not some magic book of rules around how relationships are supposed to work, that once you figure out the rules, it's all smooth sailing. This is really taking the data from each interaction and asking, did that get me closer to the connection that I want, or the boundaries that I need, or did that move me away, and adjusting accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah, and did that bring us closer together or push us further apart? You know,
Yeah.
do I understand you better, or am I just mad?
Mm-hmm.
So somebody has asked about conflict resolution agreement. Is there a resource you can recommend that offers a sample conflict resolution agreement?
There's not a specific one that I'm thinking of. Are you thinking of any, Scott?
I think in Out of the Doghouse, Rob Weiss put in a sample conflict agreement. So I'll dig that up and I'll post it on our website as a blog. So just check back with Sex and Relationship Healing later today or tomorrow, and I'll have the one that Rob uses posted. You know, they all look different.
Yeah.
But it's something you could take into your therapist and discuss, and sit down with your spouse and discuss and customize. So.
There's another, you know, I'm glad that there's resources that go right to the conflict resolution agreement. There's something I use with couples that comes from the Gottman Institute, and it's called Aftermath of a Fight, or Aftermath of a Disagreement, or I think it's Aftermath of a Fight. And then you can actually buy the packet on their website, and it's 5 steps. And what it gets you to, after we've had a fight, a disagreement, we go through these 5 steps, and the 5th step is really the stuff that you would put on a conflict resolution agreement. In the future, this is what I need from you in this kind of situation. But there's a whole lot of background to that. Like, here's where I was at emotionally. This is what I saw happen. This is the trigger for me. You know, this is where I can make some amends. You know, so there's a lot of resources out there to get couples to there.
Yeah, and the Gottman Institute has a lot of good stuff recommended. And Sue Johnson, what's her book called?
Hold Me Tight. She had another one that was after that, but I'm not remembering the name of it.
Hold Me Tight's the one that's really kind of cool. She doesn't talk so much about conflict resolution, but she does talk about developing an understanding of the other person, and that's her real whole focus. She calls it emotionally focused therapy for couples. Actually, I think that's the title of the other book, isn't it? Emotionally focused therapy for couples. Is that Sue?
That sounds right. I think that would be so.
Yeah. So cool stuff there.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, I think that brings up a point too. There's not one right way to do it. And if you look at like Sue's approach versus like what Rob's got in Out of the Doghouse, or how the Gottmans do it, the Gottmans and Rob, I think, are a lot more like, here's the structure that you're going to go through. And Sue is a lot more about, or Sue Johnson is a lot more about, this is how we do it. This is the nature we do it in. And for some couples, they love the process, and they love, like, I don't really care what resolution we get to as long as it felt right to me. And other couples, it's all about what did we agree on, and what do we need to do. And you know, the resources that you'll use and the ones that will resonate with you, they depend a lot on how you and your partner are tuned and what you and your partner want in a relationship.
But either way, you know, the willingness to sit down and have a conversation is so important. I mean, that's the connection. The effort is you know, again, I love you.
And so that takes me back to the original, like, where's my line? Why we pay attention to this is because over time you can start to retrain your partner to expect from you that when I talk to you about things that are bothering you, every single one of these is resolvable, or every single one of these is something that I'm already engaged in, instead of when we talk, it's I've flipped my lid or you've blown your top, and we're just arguing and not talking. So it takes it back to when we talk about problems, it's because I have confidence that we can solve these together, versus when we have problem means that we've reached something that's irresolvable. That's it's a non-starter for us. And a lot of, I think, relationships in recovery, that's where they start when you get into recovery, is we have a lot that has built up. And it really, I think it really undermines our how we might clearly communicate our desire to connect and be with our partner, because there's so much in the way. um, it's like with your dental hygiene. If you didn't go to the dentist a couple times a year and brush your teeth twice a day, there would be big problems that built up. But there's a lot, not just from a dental health side, but overall physical health side. When you pay attention to that on a daily basis, um, you can resolve a lot of problems as they come up.
Yeah, there's no more damaging stress to the body than relationship stress.
Right, right. It really gets at that core of, we all need to be connected. Again, these four attachment styles, we all need to be connected. We all need to have a place. And when we don't, that's survival stuff. And we can't stay in that survival place very long before it becomes toxic for us to be there. It's meant to be a short-term thing. But I think when it comes to relationships, it's more often a very long-term thing, because we're really trying to bridge the gap between two cultures. Even if, like my son has grown up in my home and he has a completely different worldview than I do and a completely different reference than I do. And you have to respect that. That's why relationships are a really long-term thing.
The whole science of attachment, for people who are curious, kind of started right around World War II. There was this guy, John Bowlby. I think he was in the UK.
Yeah.
And he was researching orphan babies during the war. And they basically just lined them up and had nurses go around and feed them and burp them and change their diaper. And he was just an assembly line. And these kids did not do very well, and some of them actually died, even though there was nothing physically wrong with them. What they weren't getting was connection.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have a mother or father to hold them and look at, eye contact is very important for babies. They didn't get that, and some of them died, and most of them had other problems as they developed. So when John says, this need for attachment is a matter of survival, it really is.
Yeah.
And I'm sure all of those kids grew up, to be avoidant or dismissive or preoccupied, rather than secure, because.
What other option did they have?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's really interesting. I love the attachment research that comes out of World War II. And one of my favorite pieces of that, so when the Blitz was happening in London, they made the decision for families who could, they moved their kids to the countryside. This is where that whole Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe story starts, is these kids who left London during the Blitz go to this country home with this stranger who decided to take them in. And it was this, I think it was a wonderful act of national compassion that people would open their homes to get children out of this dangerous situation. But what they ended up seeing is that the kids who stayed with their families, and that was the key, they had to be with their families and familiar people, they had lower incidence of stress and PTSD than the kids who went to the countryside. So the kids who were on the front lines of the war had less PTSD than the kids who were away. And the kids who were away had higher incidences of PTSD because they were disconnected from the familiar people that they were attached to. So those strong relationships can get us through a lot. It's a very, very protective factor. But yeah, I think there's a lot of fascinating stuff that comes out of that time period around attachment. And we started looking at relationships in a very different way post World War II.
it changed the way we think about, the American ethos has always been, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, especially if you're a man. Oh God, you don't need anybody. Don't let anybody do anything for you. You make it
Hmm.
on your own. And it's exactly the opposite of what we need.
Yeah.
You know, incidents of heart attack are like twice as high for single males as married males. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Just all of it. Single people die younger than even just having a pet will extend your lifespan and reduce your
Hmm.
stress and all of that. They did a study with monkeys, rhesus monkeys. This was shortly after Bowlby. I think this was done in the 50s, where they separated from their mothers and they offered them a wire mother that had food or a squashy rag mother. And they invariably went
Hmm.
to the squashy rag because it at least felt soft and warm.
Hmm.
That was more important to these little rhesus monkeys than food.
Yeah, they valued the softness and the warmth more than nutrition. And these are baby monkeys. There's not a lot of thought process there. That's pretty instinctual. And I can definitely, I can definitely support that finding. I've seen it again and again. We'll go for what's comfortable and soft versus what's actually nourishing. The best scenario is that we get both of those together. Um,
Yeah.
if given the choice, we'll take comfort now versus long-term nutrients.
Yeah, yeah, and those rhesus monkeys who were separated from their monkey mothers, I guess, they had problems later in life. They weren't able to socialize like rhesus monkeys normally do. They weren't able to mate like rhesus monkeys normally do. So is it any wonder that humans basically react in the same way? We become addicts, we become depressed, we become anxious, we become dismissive and preoccupied and avoidant.
Yeah.
So we're kind of running out of time here. Anything you want to say to wrap us up, John?
I would just say, as with all things that we've talked about, I hope you'll go out and you'll try something new with this, and keeping in mind that this isn't a silver bullet for you. This isn't one thing that's going to change the whole outlook of your relationship, likely, but it is something that can give you a little bit of different data than you've been getting, and that's really what doing relationships better and doing recovery better is all about. Is about getting out there and trying something, and then being willing to look at, what did I get back from that? Did that move me closer to my goal or not? So I hope you'll take the ideas and think of maybe something that you want to try out, and it's definitely something you can bring back to the webinar next week. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, John. Thank you, everybody, for attending. John will be back with Tammy next week. And if you like me a lot, you can come see me Wednesdays at 5 with Dr. David Fawcett. I'm there every Wednesday. So bye, everybody.
Thank you. See you next week.